The coronavirus is spreading in ways that make it even more mysterious.
Right. So first, there's some good news. The number of confirmed cases in China is reportedly dropping. But at the same time, there are significant new outbreaks in South Korea and in Italy, and at least 8 people in Iran have died from the virus. Now, those countries and others are doing what they can to contain it. The problem is no one really understands how this virus is being transmitted.
NPR's Jason Beaubien has been following the coronavirus story and joins us now from Hong Kong. So, Jason, why this rise in cases all of a sudden in several different places over the last few days?
It's really not clear why all of a sudden we're getting these sudden outbreaks in all of these different places. We don't know exactly what the chain of transmission was that has sparked this, and that makes it even harder to respond to it. These new outbreaks came on really incredibly quickly. Last week, Italy had only reported 3 cases. Now they're reporting more than 150.
Right.
Iran, as of last week, hadn't reported any cases, and now they've got several dozen confirmed, and as you mentioned, at least 8 dead. That death number suggests that the outbreak probably had been brewing for a while, and that there could be potentially hundreds of cases that are out there that are undetected. South Korea now is up above 800 cases. Again, that explosion of cases, most of them were coming last week. There was 150 cases reported yesterday, another 70 reported today out of Korea. And in addition, it's not just these big outbreaks. We're also seeing 7 Middle Eastern countries now all having reported a case at least. So it's spreading both geographically and you're getting these new hotspots.
So what do those countries do? I mean, especially in a place where there's only one or a handful of cases. Do they lock the whole place down still?
So those places are trying to contain it, where they only have 1 or 2 cases. Places like Italy and also Iran, they're going in and quarantining. Italy has put up roadblocks. They're canceling school, canceling universities. Some lawmakers in Iran are talking about quarantining the city of Qom, maybe even having to quarantine Tehran if things get much worse.
What's going on in Hong Kong, where you are?
So Hong Kong, it's kind of cruising along. We had another 4 cases today. 2 of them were people who had come back and they were in quarantine. They had been on the Diamond Princess. So we've got 5 people who tested negative in Japan from the Diamond Princess. Now they're back and they've tested positive. And then there's 2 other cases. We have another cluster at a Buddhist temple here. They've got tens of thousands of people under home quarantine. And, they're trying to manage this as best they can, but you're not seeing the huge numbers like you are in some other places.
So what's the messaging right now from World Health officials, especially because it just seems so nonsensical where it's popping up and to what degree?
Yeah, there's, great concern that we have reached a turning point. I talked to this guy, Dirk Pfeiffer. He studies emerging infectious diseases at the City University of Hong Kong. And he was basically saying that he believes this has become a pandemic and the world should start preparing for transmission occurring globally. We're also hearing similar things to that from the World Health Organization. And basically people are saying we may need to really shift now and think about this differently, think about it as something like the flu that we're going to have to deal with on an ongoing basis and not as an emergency.
NPR's Jason Beaubien, we appreciate it. All right, the Democratic presidential primary now moves to South Carolina this week.
That's right, and so candidates will turn their focus there. Meanwhile, on Saturday, Bernie Sanders won the Nevada caucuses overwhelmingly. Entrance polls show that he won many important demographic groups, men and women, voters 64 and younger, and he won big among Latinx voters.
All right, NPR's Tamara Keith is with us this morning. Hi, Tam.
Good morning.
So help us sketch out what is ahead. How does what happened in Nevada, which is a Bernie Sanders victory, how will that play into or shift the sands in South Carolina?
We can't be sure, but what I know is that Bernie Sanders has added an extra rally in South Carolina, which is to say that there is a sense of momentum, and his campaign looked at the results in Nevada and said, hey, maybe we have a chance to make a play in South Carolina.
Had they not thought that, Tam?
Certainly he was going to try in South Carolina, but the fact that they're adding more means that they see a chance to really compete with Vice President Joe Biden in a state, South Carolina, that he has really staked his candidacy on. Vice President Biden has said South Carolina is the state that he needed to do well in Nevada, and he needs to win in South Carolina. Well, he got second place in Nevada,
right.
and now you turn to South Carolina.
So let's play a clip. This is the former vice president speaking on MSNBC yesterday.
I really believe I'm going to do very well here, and I'm going to do very well on Super Tuesday. I've had the broadest constituency in the sense that working class, high school educated whites and African Americans have been the base of my support.
And as you noted, South Carolina, obviously very important to Joe Biden. He has enjoyed a double-digit lead there for a long time. But, I mean, how solid is his advantage at this moment?
There is not a lot of really great polling out of South Carolina, so it's not clear just how much the ground has shifted under him or whether it has. But this is a state that is absolutely critical for him. At this point in the race, there's the Bernie Sanders lane, and then there is a traffic jam in the everyone else lane. And every other candidate is trying to prove that they are in the strongest position to take on Sanders and eventually President Trump. And Biden is looking for the results in South Carolina to prove that for him to be able to say, hey, look, I've got this broad base. What Bernie Sanders got out of Nevada was he is now able to say that he has a very broad base, that he was able to expand beyond young white people.
Mm-hmm. So, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, President Trump has been in India. He is in India. And notably, there are no Democrats holding political rallies there for their campaigns. And I say that because Trump's travel schedule has tended to run in parallel to the Democratic contenders as of late.
He's been something of a shadow or a counter-programmer. About a day before every single one of these Democratic primary contests, he has shown up. So he is going to South Carolina on Friday before their Saturday primary. And then on Monday, he goes to North Carolina. And that is one of the 14 states and territories voting on Super Tuesday.
All right, NPR's Tam Keith for us. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right, huge adoring crowds, baseball hats with simple slogans, and a big personality on stage. These are the basic ingredients of a Trump rally anywhere in America. Today, though, it is the scene in Gujarat, India.
That's the sound of a crowd inside a cricket stadium, and those baseball caps don't say "Make America Great Again." They say "Namaste, Trump." India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi was in the U.S. last fall for an event called Howdy Modi, and today India returned the favor. President Trump was invited to give an address during his visit to India.
NPR's Lauren Frayer was at that very rally, and she joins us now. Hi, Lauren.
Hi, still am.
You're still there, so are people still lingering? I mean, what's the atmosphere like?
This is a stadium of 100,000 people, all wearing white baseball caps that you mentioned that read Namaste in Hindi, that means hello or welcome, and then Trump in English. And they were blasting Bollywood songs, but they switched to the song Macho Man just as Trump and Modi took the stage. It feels like every lamppost in this city is plastered with portraits of Trump and Modi holding hands. This is Modi's home state, and he's just throwing a gigantic welcome party for Trump. There are school groups here, Hindu nationalist groups, business leaders. I saw a bare-chested guy with his whole body painted in the colors of the U.S. and Indian flags.
Wow.
There are some Indian Americans here. I spoke with Daksha Dalal. She came all the way from Kansas City.
I'm feeling proud and exuberant that two big democracies in action, working together. One on the east, one on the west.
And she's a registered Democrat, but she voted for Trump last time, and she says she'll do so again in November.
Amazing. So, I mean, they've rolled out the red carpet. Modi has gone all out. Clearly, there are a lot of fans there for Modi and Trump, but more broadly, I mean, is Donald Trump popular in India?
He is. He's very popular. He is seen as a strong leader. You've got to go back to 1959 and Dwight Eisenhower to find a U.S. president addressing a crowd like this in India. Trump had praise for Modi when he spoke to the crowd, and it was just effusive. Here was what he had to say.
America loves India. America respects India. And America will always be faithful and loyal friends to the Indian people.
The crowd cheered when Trump said he's working to fight Islamist terrorism. The only time the crowd went silent was when Trump mentioned how he's also working with Pakistan, India's arch rival. But really, mostly it was light. He mentioned Bollywood films. He dropped a few famous names of cricket stars, botched the pronunciations of some of those, but the crowd went wild nonetheless.
It's the effort that counts, I guess. So is this just about the spectacle of all of it, or is there any policy being made on this trip?
Not much. I mean, this trip seems to be so far more about pageantry and optics over substance. This evening, Trump and the First Lady are going to the Taj Mahal and then will overnight in the capital, New Delhi. Tomorrow is the policy day, and Trump will be holding bilateral meetings and possibly some trade talks there.
Maybe catch a Bollywood film. Who knows?
Who knows?
NPR's Lauren Frayer. She was talking to us from the enormous rally in India. Prime Minister Narendra Modi had welcomed President Trump, who gave an address there just moments ago. Lauren, thanks. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. Namaste.
Markets are opening this morning after the Dow fell over 1,000 points yesterday over concerns about the coronavirus.
Yeah, and the Trump administration has requested billions of dollars in supplemental funding to fight the virus. Other countries are also taking additional measures to stop the spread. The World Health Organization says the virus is not a pandemic yet, which basically means it's still possible these outbreaks can be contained.
Let's bring in NPR science correspondent Richard Harris to talk us through this. Good morning, Richard.
Good morning, David.
So this disease, we should say, has certainly spread in Asia. It's gotten to North America, Europe, the Middle East. I mean, it sounds global, but why is the WHO not saying this is a pandemic at this point?
Well, the term pandemic isn't simply that a disease is spreading around the world, as the name implies. The WHO also thinks that how severe it is counts, and how big an impact it has is also part of their equation. As the WHO Director Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus explained yesterday, the disease needs to have significant impact on at least 2 continents for him to consider it a pandemic, and he's also really mindful of the power of a label.
This is not the time to focus on what word we use. That will not prevent a single infection today or save a single life today.
He says it is entirely possible, of course, that this will become a pandemic, but by his definition, he says we're not there yet.
Okay, so he's saying let's not focus on what word we use. Does wording not make a difference, or is it important somehow?
Well, it does make a difference, but it's a psychological difference. The WHO, in fact, has already declared that COVID-19, what they call this disease, is a public health emergency of international concern. That's their technical term. It means it's a step that they take when in order to marshal international action. In fact, that has done that. That declaration has brought in hundreds of millions of additional dollars, and it has stirred action around the world. Honestly, it's journalists who keep asking Tedros whether we should be calling this thing a pandemic, and he's been circumspect. He really doesn't want to create a panic.
Well, I mean, just to put this all in context, when has this term pandemic been applied in the past?
It has been applied for major influenza pandemics, outbreaks, including 2 in the previous century and one around 2009, which swept the globe and killed something like 500,000 people. It wasn't the worst possible pandemic, but it was a nasty flu season for sure. Dr. Michael Ryan at the WHO said health officials know a lot about the flu, though, in comparison with the new coronavirus.
Pandemics of influenza can be sometimes called a lot earlier because we know we've had previous pandemics. And we know with influenza that when there's highly efficient community transmission, as we see with seasonal flu, that the disease does spread around the world, and it has proven that time and time again. So it's much easier to say a pandemic will occur in an influenza situation.
Richard, let's just talk about the response so far to this disease. I mean, the response has been restricting the movement of people, tracking who people come in contact with, quarantining some people, monitoring them. Is that strategy seen as something that's working? Do we expect it to change if this gets worse?
Well, yes, I think that the strategy would change. If the disease spreads far enough in a community, at some point it really becomes impractical to try to track down every single individual who might have been exposed. It's like, imagine trying to do that for the flu. Dr. Ryan says WHO does not support the idea of travel restrictions either. Again, think of the flu. We don't shut down airlines for the flu season in this country or around the world. Yeah, and in fact, they do very little to slow an outbreak. Countries like to do them. They have a good psychological impact for them, but they don't do much to slow an outbreak. And the WHO is concerned that it will actually slow the transit of needed medical supplies. So that's an issue. But officials have raised some other aggressive issues that China has not taken, such as closing schools and telling people to avoid large gatherings. Measures like that still do make a lot of sense.
NPR science correspondent Richard Harris. Richard, thanks as always.
It's my pleasure.
All right, time for another debate. The Democratic candidates for president will be meeting on stage tonight in South Carolina.
Yeah, and one of the big questions is whether and how they will go after the frontrunner, Bernie Sanders. South Carolina's primary is on Saturday.
And let's bring in NPR political reporter Juana Summers, who is in Charleston ahead of the debate. Hi, Juana.
Good morning.
All right, so frontrunner Bernie Sanders, he gets a big victory in Nevada. Everyone is expecting him to come under attack tonight. It sounds like we're getting a preview of that already in some of these ads that have come out.
You're right, we are. They have really started mounting. One of the most stark ones come from Joe Biden's campaign. The former vice president's campaign is airing this new digital ad in South Carolina. In the ad, Bernie Sanders of trying to undermine President Obama's 2012 re-election campaign by threatening a primary challenge to him.
When it comes to building on President Obama's legacy, Bernie Sanders just can't be trusted.
Wow, that's blunt.
It's really blunt, and it's important to note Sanders' campaign has denied the idea that the senator had any designs on mounting a primary challenge to Obama. But here in South Carolina, a state with a heavily black electorate, this is a really charged message. I also got another preview of some of the attacks that might come tonight at a dinner last night for the South Carolina Democratic Party. Two different Democrats kind of offered up a template. Pete Buttigieg spoke after Sanders, and he drew a direct contrast, saying that some of Sanders' plans were unrealistic and that he could potentially be a drag on down-ticket Democratic candidates. And Tom Steyer, who has been in the state more than any other candidates, is making an economic argument against Sanders, who is a self-described Democratic socialist, and he argues that Sanders' politics and policies are bad for working-class Americans. There's also one big question, and it's around Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren. She's, of course, been a frequent ally of Bernie Sanders, and in that last debate, she launched a number of forceful attacks against a variety of candidates. But that's not something she's done with Bernie Sanders yet. Now that he's picked up another victory, we're curious to see if that changes.
Do we get the sense that Sanders is ready for attacks like this? I mean, how has he been responding so far?
Yeah, so it's interesting. He's really been focused on capitalizing in the momentum he's built and showing that he can win. He's even pouring more resources here into South Carolina, a state that did not go well for him in 2016, but where he's rising in the polls now. He's also been highlighting some favorable polling numbers against President Trump.
I know you're hearing on TV a lot, Bernie can't win. Don't believe everything you hear on TV. Truth is that on virtually all of the national polls, we are defeating Donald Trump.
Now, that is clearly an attempt to reassure Democrats about Bernie Sanders' electability if he does win the nomination.
Well, and I mean, heading to South Carolina now, we should talk about Vice President Joe Biden. I mean, this is a very important state for him. I mean, how hard has his campaign been working there?
They're working really hard. This is close to a must-win for him. More than half of the Democratic electorate is black here. That's one of his strongest bases of support. They are putting a lot of effort here and hoping that he might get a boost from House Majority Whip Jim Clyburn, who's expected to announce his endorsement tomorrow morning.
All right. NPR's Juana Summers in Charleston, South Carolina, ahead of tonight's debate. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, President Trump is wrapping up a 2-day visit to India.
That's right. Yesterday, he spoke to a huge crowd, more than 100,000 people at a Namaste Trump rally in the Indian Prime Minister's home state of Gujarat.
And today, the two leaders meet again in New Delhi, and NPR's Lauren Frayer is there. Hi, Lauren.
Hi, David.
So, I mean, we talk a lot about visits like this as to whether they are largely symbolic or whether anything is really accomplished. Is there anything to point to in terms of progress or accomplishments between these two leaders?
Well, there was speculation about a trade deal this week. President Trump cited tremendous advances toward that, but no deal while he's here. And instead, he said India signed a very different deal to buy more than $3 billion of U.S. military equipment, including helicopters. But what was really interesting was something else Trump said when he and Prime Minister Modi made statements to the press today. Listen to this.
Our two countries have always been united by shared traditions of democracy and constitutions that protect freedom, individual rights, and the rule of law.
And let me tell you why it's significant that Trump mentioned India's constitution. Prime Minister Modi has been facing nationwide protests over a new citizenship law that excludes Muslim refugees. Protesters say it violates the secular values that are enshrined in India's constitution. And it's an allegation that has long dogged Modi. He's a Hindu nationalist. He believes India should be a Hindu nation with special rights for its 80% Hindu majority. And that makes minorities nervous. And several people were killed in clashes over this yesterday in Delhi, mere hours before Trump landed here.
So what is the significance, if we step back, of seeing these two leaders on stage together?
So much has been made of this sort of bromance between Trump and Modi. They held hands on stage at a stadium rally yesterday in Modi's home state. There was Howdy Modi rally last year in Houston. Here it was Namaste Trump this week. There's a lot of pageantry, but they're both nationalists who have been accused of discriminating against minorities. Modi was actually accused of inciting violence against Muslims in the early 2000s in his home state, exactly where that rally was yesterday. So much so that the U.S. actually denied him a visa to visit the U.S. for years, until just before he became prime minister in 2014. The violence yesterday in Delhi and these massive protests that I mentioned over the citizenship law may be why Modi and Trump didn't take a single question today. Trump will do a solo presser with the media later today, but Modi is really infamous for hardly ever taking open questions from the media. Previously, any criticism of press freedom or minority rights has been kind of behind closed doors. India is a democracy. It's increasingly important to the U.S.
In what way? How is India important?
Strategic importance. The U.S. is increasingly looking to India as a buffer to China's growing power in the Indo-Pacific, and India shares that concern. It's got a 2,000-mile border with China.
NPR's Lauren Frayer reporting on this visit of President Trump to India, which is wrapping up. Lauren, thanks so much. We really appreciate it.
South Carolina's primary is on Saturday, and then 3 days later, it's Super Tuesday, and people in 14 states will vote.
Yeah, we are getting into that season. So the Democratic presidential candidates last night had this chaotic debate in Charleston, South Carolina. Let's listen to them from CBS News here.
Let's talk about it. Can I say something? Look, first of all, let me go.
Bernie, I was talking about all I know is if we spend the next 4 months tearing our party apart, we're going to watch Donald Trump spend the next 4 years tearing our country apart.
Wow, that all made sense, right? So did this latest debate in some way alter the course of the Democratic primary?
NPR political correspondent Asma Khalid is on the line from South Carolina. Good morning, Asma.
Good morning.
So that was a lot last night. We had suspected that the other candidates would go after Bernie Sanders, and they did. He's the front runner. What did it look like?
Well, you're right. It was a lot of bickering and a lot of shouting and a lot of ire directed at Bernie Sanders. Right off the bat, Elizabeth Warren, for the first time, really tried to draw distinctions between herself and Sanders while also stressing their similar policy ideas. And she cited her ability to get things done.
Bernie and I both want to see universal health care, but Bernie's plan doesn't explain how to get there, doesn't show how we're going to get enough allies into it, and doesn't show enough about how we're going to pay for it. I dug in, I did the work, and then Bernie's team trashed me for it. We need a president who is going to dig in, do the hard work, and actually get it done. Progressives have got one shot.
And then we also saw that recent comments by Sanders to 60 Minutes also came up. That put Sanders a bit on the defensive. In that interview, he had criticized Fidel Castro's authoritarian regime, but also did praise the government's literacy programs, suggesting that there were some positive benefits that occurred there. And Sanders says that this is something that President Obama also cited about Cuba and tried to stress that he was, again, opposed to authoritarianism. But it was hard for him to sort of praise some of these social welfare programs while also drawing a kind of nuanced distinction around authoritarianism. And it's not clear, I will say, though, that all these attacks against Sanders were particularly effective, but it was clear that the candidates realized that he's the front runner and he was targeted more than he had been in any previous debate.
So the stakes are high for him. The stakes are also possibly even higher for Joe Biden, right? Because he's been saying, I am going to win South Carolina. I'm going to win win big. What's his campaign saying after the debate?
Well, they are projecting confidence, but on stage, there was a clear sense to me that Biden felt a sense of urgency. He was asking to speak, trying to get more time, and indicating, I think, that this week is really important for him, and in part because Biden has banked his campaign on the theory that he would do better here because a majority of Democratic voters are African American.
And in fact, race came up big in the debate last night, right?
That's right. And a lot of the discussion started with Mike Bloomberg and some of the controversies around his stop and frisk program. That's a policing strategy that was under the mayor of New York City that disproportionately targeted minorities. And, when Pete Buttigieg was asked about the policy, he tried to make this larger point about the diversity of the candidates. To me, it was clear that the candidates knew their audience. They were tailoring their answers to what they thought Black voters wanted to hear. So you had multiple candidates name drop James Clyburn. He's the prominent Black congressman from South Carolina. At one point near the end, it seemed that Joe Biden was essentially offering a promise that he would appoint a Black woman to the Supreme Court. It's an indication that Black voters are really important here in South Carolina.
Asma Khalid, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
All right, back to Super Tuesday, a big day, March 3rd. People in 14 states will go out and vote.
That's right. And NPR this election year has chosen to focus on some key places around the country. We are asking where voters are, where they are on the issues, the candidates, or just where they are, because your community really can shape your political views.
Our co-host Steve Inskeep is kicking off this series in Charlotte, North Carolina. Hey, Steve.
Hey there, Noelle. Hi, David.
Why'd you end up in Charlotte?
It's in a Super Tuesday state, North Carolina. It's also the city, Charlotte is, where they're going to hold the Republican convention this summer. And then this fall, North Carolina is almost certain to be one of the swing states. And it's a big state. It's twice the size of South Carolina, for example. So this is a state that's going to be in the news all year.
Okay, so you have been out hitting the pavement talking to people. How does the election look from Charlotte?
The first thing to note is that this is a really prosperous city. It's a banking city. The skyline of this city amazes you if you've never been here before. On your way in from the airport, it just takes your breath away. But a lot of people here, Noelle, feel that they don't share equally in that prosperity. A study a few years ago found that Charlotte is the least upwardly mobile major city. Some residents experience the growth here as gentrification that pushes them aside. Now, our colleague Sarah McCammon is part of our team of reporters who will be talking to voters here throughout the election year, and she spoke with Maya Wells, who's a college student here, and she wants radical change in both domestic and foreign policy, and she said that means she can only vote at all, if the Democratic nominee is one particular candidate. Let's listen.
It really depends. If it's Bernie Sanders, absolutely. But if it's Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, Steyer, what have you, it truly depends what their stances are on foreign policy, because I've had it.
You can hear her there, just not even caring to pronounce the names of the other candidates. There's a dilemma here for Democrats who feel they really have to defeat President Trump, no matter who's nominated. And the dilemma is apparent when you listen to a different view in a more prosperous, more suburban area of Charlotte, which is where our team found Colleen Willis. She's a mother of two and says she would vote for anybody to get Trump out, or rather, almost anybody.
I would vote for Trump over Bernie. He's about the only one who would convince, maybe Warren as well. If Warren or Bernie are the Democratic ticket, I'll vote for Trump. Otherwise, I'll vote Democratic.
Yeah, our colleague Steve Harrison of WFAE here in Charlotte spoke with Willis. He then went back and spoke with her again the next day, and she said, on reflection, maybe she could vote for Bernie Sanders. She's that opposed to the president. And there could be a lot riding on that agonizing personal decision, which is one of the subtleties we hope to capture by the way we're doing this series. We mean to linger in this city for days at a time. We mean to come again later, circle back to voters we'd met before, and get a fuller picture of where voters are.
And just really quickly, you did speak to conservative residents there as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. As you head to the edges of the metro area, people get a lot more conservative, and they're voting much more often on what we'd think of as cultural issues, things like abortion and guns, and just the differences between attitudes and generations.
Okay, Steve Inskeep in Charlotte, North Carolina. That's a city we're adopting as we launch the project Where Voters Are. Thanks, Steve.
Glad to do it.
Public health officials say that the coronavirus will spread in this country. It's just a matter of when.
That's right. Here is Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar yesterday.
The immediate risk to the general American public remains low. But as we have warned, that has the potential to change quickly.
Now, we should say San Francisco's mayor has declared a local state of emergency yesterday. This is just the latest effort by local authorities in the U.S. preparing to take on this virus. But when a coronavirus outbreak does occur in the United States, what is containment going to look like?
NPR Global Health correspondent Jason Beaubien is in Hong Kong this morning. Hi, Jason.
Hey, good morning.
Okay, so you've been looking at the whole world here, even though you're in Hong Kong. Let me start by asking you why U.S. officials are now saying that the virus is definitely going to spread in the United States.
Look, we've got millions of people who fly into the U.S. every week from all over the world. So when you start getting these large outbreaks abroad and it's hitting all of these different countries, it is inevitable that you're going to get cases showing up in the United States. Other countries that have responded well, they've identified cases when they come in. They've identified people with possible exposure. They've isolated them. They've kept it from spreading, and they've managed this well. Singapore is a good example of that.
Hong Kong is also a good example. That's part of the reason you're there. The number of infections is low, even though it shares a border with China. So has Hong Kong figured out something that Iran and Italy and South Korea have not?
Well, Hong Kong was hit really hard by SARS in 2003, and people here remember SARS, and they are willing to take measures to combat this one to keep it from turning into a SARS. Almost everyone on the street is wearing a mask. People don't shake hands. Schools are closed. I was just talking with Keiji Fukuda. He was one of the top people at the World Health Organization during the West Africa Ebola outbreak, and he now heads the School of Public Health here at the University of Hong Kong.
I think Hong Kong is an excellent example of why we can think that these methods work. Just a few miles away across the border, we have much larger numbers of cases. And yet in Hong Kong, we see that over the past 5 weeks, 6 weeks or so, the number of cases has remained remarkably small.
He notes that the measures that Hong Kong is taking are not easy. More than 10,000 people are in various forms of quarantine here right now. But Hong Kong, despite having dozens of cases pop up in its hospitals, you have not had sustained transmission in the community like you've seen in some other places.
Jason, here in the U.S., should we be prepared for quarantines and schools and businesses closing?
I think that's probably going to be a possibility. You're definitely going to have more quarantines that are going to be needed as cases show up. And you're also going to have local health departments getting out there and tracking down people. It's going to be a big effort.
Okay, NPR's Jason Beaubien. Jason, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
And just some news from this morning as we continue to track the virus. The first U.S. service member has tested positive for coronavirus.
The message from the Trump administration on coronavirus is twofold. Things will get worse here in the United States, but also it will be under control.
The president stood in the White House briefing room yesterday to announce a new approach to the virus. Several health officials joined him. CDC Deputy Director Ann Shukett said the United States should expect some troubling news.
Our aggressive containment strategy here in the United States has been working and is responsible for the low levels of cases that we have so far. However, we do expect more cases.
And shortly after that press conference, a new mysterious case of coronavirus was announced in California.
And that's where I want to begin with NPR health correspondent Rob Stein. Hey there, Rob.
Hey there.
Okay, let's talk about this new case here in California and what the significance of it could be.
Yeah, so the CDC, right after this briefing ended last night, reported that someone in California who doesn't appear to have traveled to any country where the virus is spreading or was exposed to anyone who might have caught the virus overseas had tested positive for the virus. That means this could be the first instance in the United States of what officials call community spread. You know, in other words, they caught the virus in this country with no connection to any other country, that it could have spread here. There's been 60 reported cases of coronavirus in this country so far. All the other cases have been people who caught it in China or on that cruise ship, except for two close relatives of two of those people who brought it back from China. So this would be very concerning, because it's exactly what health officials have been worried might start happening, that the virus could start spreading in this country. Now, the CDC says it can't completely rule out that this person might have had some contact with a traveler they don't know about, but so far that doesn't seem to be the case.
Okay, well, then the question on all of our minds, of course, is what do we know about this person and how the person may have gotten the virus, if not through someone abroad?
Yeah, so California health officials say the person lives in Solano County, north of San Francisco, and that this person is receiving care at the UC Medical Center. And according to the hospital, the patient was transferred there from another medical center, and doctors suspected the patient might have COVID-19, this disease that coronavirus causes. But since the patient didn't meet all the criteria for the coronavirus, they weren't immediately tested by the CDC. And in the meantime, the hospital, has treated other patients with viruses like this, so took all the necessary precautions to protect doctors and nurses. But after this patient did finally test positive, the hospital asked a small number of hospital workers to stay home and monitor themselves.
Okay, so this could be the beginning of what's known as community spread in the United States, although it sounds like there's some uncertainty here. But that obviously raises the question of how prepared we are in this country to deal with the coronavirus. What did you feel like you learned from the Trump administration when the president and others talked about the approach yesterday?
Yeah, so the president, he took a very kind of low-key approach to this and, was tried to be very reassuring, saying, things are under control. But the president announced that Vice President Mike Pence would be taking over in charge of coordinating the nation's response to the outbreak. Until now, Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar has been chairing the coronavirus task force. Now, he'll stay in that role, but Trump says he picked Pence because of his experience handling healthcare issues, especially when he was governor of Indiana, and that he will hopefully, help coordinate this across government agencies, including like the transportation and education departments.
NPR health correspondent Rob Stein. Rob, thanks so much.
You bet, David.
Now, the administration is facing scrutiny as concerns increase over the spread of coronavirus in the U.S. Reporters asked the president yesterday why he seems to be contradicting Centers for Disease Control officials who say the coronavirus outbreak here is only a matter of time. Here was the president's response.
I don't think I have. They've said it could be worse, and I've said it could be worse too. I also think, no, I don't think it's inevitable. I don't think it's inevitable.
All right, I want to bring in NPR senior political correspondent Domenico Montanaro, who's been following the president's response here. Hi, Domenico.
Hey there, David.
Okay, so this could be a big moment for the president if indeed this virus spreads and Americans start looking for some level of reassurance and confidence.
Oh, definitely. I mean, the president's gotten a lot of criticism for this confused messaging before this on coronavirus. You had the CDC sounding the alarm. They were saying that the spread was inevitable. You had Trump downplaying this. And really, in a lot of these situations, I mean, I kind of think of it as being on a plane and facing turbulence and you're in stormy weather. You want the pilot to be calm, but also
everything's okay. Don't worry.
But also serious and telling you to take your seats, right? And put those safety belts on and make sure everyone does it. The president, because of his tweeting and his own personal volatility, that makes it difficult. And there's a lot of people who are never going to trust him as their pilot. But that's partially probably why he decided to put Mike Pence there, because he's such a controlled messenger. And for the most part, Trump, during that press conference, got out of the way of public health officials and even swatted down some potential conspiracy theories about whether the CDC was trying to inflate numbers or the risk to hurt his reelection.
Okay, so maybe he's putting Pence there because people have more confidence. I mean, it also sounds like Pence has experience as governor with healthcare that may put him in a good position to respond to that. What is that experience?
Well, the thing is, though, Mike Pence is a very controversial pick to put here. There was an outbreak in 2015 of HIV in his home state among intravenous drug users that is really causing a lot of critics to look at this and say they raise some eyebrows and wonder if this is the smartest person to put there. I mean, at one point, according to USA Today, the number of people who had contracted HIV in one rural county exceeded the number of people infected with HIV through injection drug use in New York City the entire previous year.
Wow.
The CDC and other health officials urged making clean needles available, but state law and Pence's moral opposition really initially prevented that. 2 months after the outbreak began, he said he was going to go home, pray on it. 2 days later, he finally issued an executive order to make those clean needles available. So, look, he's not a scientist, and I think that's one thing that a lot of people are nervous about if this does spread.
And Democrats, we should say, are already critical of the president's response here.
Definitely. They want him to ask for more money from Congress. Trump said, fine, if that's what you want. And Trump, said The stock market may have gone down, but it's Democratic presidential candidates' fault too, which is a really controversial thing to say.
NPR's Domenico Montanaro. Domenico, thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
All right, 3 days of violence in New Delhi have left at least 34 people dead.
It started with peaceful protests against a citizenship law in India that excludes Muslim refugees. The protest became a confrontation between Hindu and Muslim groups. Today seems more quiet than other recent days, which allows time to ask what went wrong and what role the police might have played.
And NPR correspondent Lauren Frayer joins us now from NPR's India bureau in Mumbai. Hi, Lauren.
Hi, David.
So what is the latest we're hearing from Delhi at this point? Things have calmed down?
It feels like a sort of nervous calm right now. Schools are still closed in this one area of New Delhi where the riots happened. Markets are still shut. Firefighters are roaming sort of deserted streets. We've seen Muslim homes, mosques burned, a few vehicles still smoldering. It's important to note that this is contained in one area. I was covering President Trump in Delhi earlier this week, and you'd never have known that such riots were raging on the other side of town. Today, families are lining up at morgues to claim bodies. The death toll keeps rising, but it does seem like most of those people were killed more than 36 hours ago, and their bodies are just being identified now.
Well, as Steve mentioned, I mean, some questions about what role police may or may not have played here. What are police saying at this point?
You know, it's remarkable how we don't actually know exactly how this violence began, who fired the first shot or threw the first stone. Here's what police are doing today. This is the Delhi Police Commissioner. His name is O.P. Mishra. We're here to protect you, is what he's saying. And that's him out on the streets patrolling personally with a microphone. He's kitted out in a flak jacket and helmet, and he's telling people not to be scared. He's telling shops to reopen. But, you know, for the past 3 days, Delhi police have been accused of not protecting people. There have been reports that they beat up human rights lawyers, destroyed CCTV cameras. They may have even egged on the attackers. The attackers are believed to be mostly Hindus, the victims mostly Muslims. Remember, India is about 80% Hindu and 14% Muslim, so Muslims are the biggest minority group here. It's interesting to note that Delhi police fall under the Home Ministry, and that is headed by Prime Minister Narendra Modi's right-hand man. His name is Amit Shah, and he's been accused of inciting violence against Muslims himself in his own speeches and on Twitter. And in fact, he's the author of this citizenship law that started all this, that prompted an outbreak of nationwide protests late last year.
Well, if there are questions about police here and the police are headed by someone close to Modi and you have dozens of people dead, I mean, could this be a real stain on the legacy of Hindu nationalists and on Modi himself?
Yeah, so it's still really early. I mean, we're barely 36 hours out of the major violence, but I have to say probably not. I mean, this has happened before. The most bloody Hindu-Muslim riots in recent memory happened in 2002 in Gujarat, where more than 1,000 people were killed, mostly Muslims. Modi was the chief minister of that state at the time. He was accused then of failing to halt, maybe even inciting violence. He denied wrongdoing, went on to be elected prime minister. And so there's a chilling lesson here that sectarian bloodletting has not hurt Modi in the past. In fact, it may have helped him rile up support among his Hindu nationalist base.
All right, that is NPR's Lauren Frayer reporting in Mumbai. Lauren, thanks so much for all of your coverage of this and for this morning.
A basic lesson of watching the stock market is that it fluctuates, so it's best not to read too much into a single bad day or even several.
Even so, it is hard to miss the message of this past week. After last night's closing bell, the NASDAQ was down more than 4% in a single day. The Dow Jones Industrial Average has lost more than 3,500 points since the middle of last week. And all of this has been happening as the coronavirus has been spreading. The Trump administration, meanwhile, has been struggling to find a convincing response.
NPR chief economics correspondent Scott Horsley has been following this story and begins our coverage of the coronavirus. Scott, good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
How significant are these losses? We just heard all these numbers, but what do they truly mean?
Yeah, it's been a rough week. I mean, the Dow lost more than 1,000 points on Monday, nearly 900 points Tuesday, took a little breather on Wednesday, down only a little over 100 points, and then the free fall yesterday with the Dow plunging almost 1,200 points. All told, the blue chips have lost nearly 13% from their peak earlier this month, and the broader S&P 500 and NASDAQ indices are also down more than 12%. What's more, Steve, the selling really accelerated at the end of the day yesterday, and the futures markets are pointed to continued losses this morning. Overnight, we saw stock losses in the Asian and European markets as well.
Okay, so if the market has dropped more than 10% in a short period of time, they call that a correction. Is that just a way for us to talk about the market, or is there some real significance to that milestone?
As a yardstick, it's pretty arbitrary. There's not a huge difference between a market that's gone down 9.9% and 10.1%, or in this case, nearly 13%. But the speed of this drop is kind of stomach churning. You know, it was just last week that the S&P and NASDAQ were setting record highs. The Dow reached its recent high on February 12th. So this has been a very rapid turnaround in sentiment. And it really signals the very swift reassessment by investors, or maybe we should say the wake-up call for investors, about the coronavirus epidemic and the potential damage it could do to the world economy.
What makes it an economic threat?
You know, what investors have been struck by this week is the surge of cases outside of China and the signal that could have for not just the production and demand in that country, but the broader economy. We saw the first cases this week in Africa, the first cases in Latin America, growing numbers of cases in Italy and elsewhere in Europe. Of course, the first case here in the U.S. that's not easily traceable to some foreign travel. All of that suggests that the problem is going to be more widespread and longer lasting than had been anticipated. Up until now, investors sort of thought this would be a hit to the economy in the first 3 months of the year and then a quick recovery. Now, Chief Economist Joe Brusuelas of RSM says it looks like the damage is going to continue at least into the summer.
Effectively, at this point, I think the first half of the year economically, we're being close to it being lost at this point.
Goldman Sachs put out a revised forecast this week that is now anticipating zero profit growth for U.S. corporations for the full year.
What, if anything, can the government do about this?
Well, there's a lot of pressure on the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates. Richard Clarida, the vice chairman of the Fed, was speaking here in Washington earlier this week. He said the central bank is monitoring the situation closely, but that it's too soon to know exactly what should be done here. Certainly, the markets are now anticipating action by the central bank, and there's going to be mounting pressure for the Fed to act.
Scott, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
That's NPR's Scott Horsley. Now, Scott mentioned this, the first case of community transmission of the coronavirus inside the United States.
That's right. So the Centers for Disease Control says the patient who has the virus was left undiagnosed for days. UC Davis Medical Center says staff requested a test for the coronavirus, but the CDC initially ruled out a test because the patient's case did not match its criteria.
NPR's Allison Aubrey is with us with more on this. Good morning.
Good morning.
Why wouldn't they just test the guy?
Well, the capacity
or
for
person.
testing...
We should say person, but go on. Yeah.
Capacity for testing is limited. I mean, there have been some hiccups with testing and diagnosis, and I think at this moment, Steve, a lot of people who are sick are probably wondering to themselves, could it be? Could it be coronavirus? But it's not as if you're going to be able to walk into your doctor's office or your local hospital and say, hey, I've got a fever or a cough. Give me a coronavirus test. It's not going to happen. I spoke to Seth Cohen. He's an infectious disease physician at the University of Washington.
As of right now, we are not implementing widespread testing. Part of the reason for this is tests are limited, and we want to test people who are really at higher risk.
So this would be people who are close contacts of those known to be infected. And he says still at this moment, it's more likely that most people with these symptoms have flu or cold.
Yeah, and I guess we should clarify, coronavirus is more deadly than the flu, but the flu is way, way, way more prevalent. You're way more likely to have that.
Absolutely. Thousands, millions of cases in the U.S. Yeah.
So how should people prepare for the possibility that the coronavirus might spread more widely than it has?
Sure. Well, you don't have to panic, but it is time to prepare. Think about it the way you think about a big snowstorm or a hurricane. If it never hits, great. But if it does, you'll be glad you prepared. So think about what you'd need in your home if you couldn't go to the grocery store for a week. Don't hoard, but stock up your cupboards with some extra food. If you're headed out to the grocery this weekend, buy a few extra items, shelf-stable stuff such as beans and rice. Also, look in your medicine cabinet to see that you have basic things like aspirin or ibuprofen. Refill your prescription medications if you can.
Are masks really of any use?
You know, healthcare providers need masks, but for the rest of us, there's not a lot of evidence that wearing one helps prevent healthy people from getting infected. But if you suddenly become the caregiver at home for someone who is infected and sick, well, then the CDC recommends using them, but they have to be well-fitted and used properly.
I suppose it's possible that adults may become caregivers at home during the day for kids who are not sick, but they can't go anywhere anymore.
That's right. I mean, the big thing to think about, if there's an outbreak in your community, schools may close. So ask your employer about work from home options. If you're a restaurant worker, that's not going to be an option. If you're a low-income worker, backup care might not be affordable. So these won't be easy recommendations to follow, but they are things that could pay off if an outbreak does happen.
Allison, I feel reassured just having some information. Really appreciate it.
Good.
That's NPR's Allison Aubrey this morning.
All right. Thanks so much.
Okay, here we go. South Carolina's Democratic presidential primary takes place tomorrow.
This is a crucial moment for several candidates. Joe Biden has staked his candidacy on his ability to win South Carolina. Tom Steyer has bought $17 million worth of local broadcast ads, hoping to win significant support, which he has failed to do elsewhere.
Victoria Hansen has been covering this primary. She's a reporter with South Carolina Public Radio, and we found her a little ways outside Charleston. Good morning.
Hey, good morning.
What's it like to be in South Carolina this week?
You know, it's exciting. It's a bit crazy, too, with so many of the candidates in town here in Charleston and all across the state. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that this is a more diverse community with more African Americans making up, well, they make up roughly 60% of the Democratic voters here.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it's the first major test for African American support. There's also more women voters here. And I just think back to the night, Tuesday night, walking up to the debate downtown at the Gilliard Center. And I walked alongside an African American woman. She was carrying a Joe Biden sign, and we kind of talked as we walked, and she was so pumped up about attending this debate, and she called Joe Biden her hero. So I couldn't help wonder, you know, during the boos for Sanders during this debate, how much that could have been because this was more of a Charleston audience. You know, I know we're known for being polite, and we are, but, you know, Joe Biden, this is kind of a second home for him. There were a lot of Joe Biden supporters there that night.
And the enthusiasm that was lacking for him elsewhere seems to be present where you are.
Yeah, he does. And not only that, you know, he has a lot of friendships with leaders in the community here. I can remember him being at the funeral for Senator Fritz Hollings. Of course, he was here for Mother Emanuel tragedy. He has longtime friendships with our former mayor, 40 years, Mayor Joe Riley. So, yeah, he's very, very well known here. In fact, when Congressman Jim Clyburn endorsed him, he said, the bottom line is we know Joe.
All right. Well, explain the rules here, though. You mentioned that the Democratic electorate can be as much as 60% black. We'll see what exactly it is based on the exit polls. But it's an open primary, which, if I'm not mistaken, means that Republicans could cross over to the Democratic primary and try to vote for the person they think that's most likely to lose in the fall. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. And in fact, we're getting lots of reports that will happen, and reports that there's this kind of a push from the Republican Party to get Republican voters out this Saturday to vote for the person they think is least likely to win. And I'm hearing that is Bernie Sanders, at least from the folks I've spoken to. I will be at the Trump rally later today, and so I'm curious to talk to folks there and see if they will tell me, you know, if that's their intention. A lot of people have told me that is, but they haven't been really willing to go, you know, on the record and say it and give me an interview that I can bring to you. But yeah, absolutely, that is something that also our state legislature is taking a look at right now and saying, you know what, we might want to change that. So they're looking at the possibility of making a change in the future.
I'm glad you mentioned the Trump rally. The president has been going to some of these places where there's a contested Democratic primary and showing up the night before. That's happening again. What is it like to be in this state where, as you said, there's a very large black population, there's a very active Democratic Party, but it's also, on the whole, a very conservative state, very Republican state?
Yeah, and that makes it, I think, very, very intense because, yes, on one side you have African-American voters very, very excited to have their voices heard. People who support Joe Biden very excited to have their voices heard. But you also have a very strong Republican base here, and that's what we're going to feel tonight when we go out to this rally. You're going to feel that strong support. And, of course, he's in town with Lindsey Graham, who's up for re-election as well.
Okay. Victoria Hansen, thanks so much for your reporting. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, you've got it. Thanks so much.
She is with South Carolina Public Radio, speaking with us on this day before the South